Now, national accounts figures this week show that growth is slowing down. It was at 0.4% in the September quarter, slipping from 0.6% in the previous 3 months. And despite the Morrison government's income tax cuts and falling interest rates, people still just aren't spending. They're saving their money. Last month, retail sales even flatlined. They didn't increase at all. Now, the government is staying optimistic, insisting they're doing enough and don't need to jeopardise their pledge of a budget surplus by spending more money on stimulus measures. But people are starting to wonder if Treasurer Josh Frydenberg has a backup plan. He joined me earlier from Canberra. Treasurer, thank you so much for your time.
Nice to be with you, Shari.
The national accounts figures came out this week and they showed an improvement in growth. But Labor's, your opposition, Jim Chalmers, attacked you in Parliament this week for economic annual growth of just 1.7%. And he said that the economy has slowed since you took over as Treasurer and since the Coalition was re-elected this year in May. Do you accept any responsibility for this slowdown in economic growth?
Well, the Australian economy faces significant domestic and global economic headwinds. We've got a devastating drought at home, and we've got the trade tensions between China and the US, which have dented global consumer sentiment and confidence. But despite that, Shari, the Australian economy is now in its 29th consecutive year of economic growth. And while other major economies like Germany, the United Kingdom, Singapore, South Korea all experience negative economic growth, Australia, in contrast, has continued to grow. And when we came to government, unemployment was 5.7%. Now it's down to 5.3%. And what we've seen in these national accounts is the fastest rate of growth in household disposable income in a decade. And we've got the first current account surplus in 40 years. We've got lowest welfare dependency in 30 years. We've had the biggest tax cuts in over 20 years, and the budget is back in balance for the first time in 11 years with a surplus on its way. So while the Labor Party will continue to irresponsibly talk down the Australian economy, and their record was pretty poor indeed, the economy has continued to grow under us and strengthen.
Treasurer, you've got the mid-year economic and fiscal outlook the week after next. Are the trends showing that the economy has improved enough, and do you think it will continue to improve enough to the extent that we no longer need further stimulus?
Well, what the Prime Minister has announced in recent weeks is significant extra spending brought forward for the economy, and I'm talking particularly about infrastructure spending, $3.8 billion brought forward into the forward estimates for major projects across the country. We've also announced a significant $500 million aged care funding package, and as you know, we've provided more than $1 billion of additional drought support since the election. So we'll continue to spend in areas where that money is needed. But what we will not do is be panicked into irresponsible spending as the Labor Party would do, because as we saw from their time in office, you had the pink bats and the overpriced school halls and the cheques that went out to dead people. We will not be doing anything like that.
Well, without panicking, are you still looking at further stimulus measures to announce at MyEFO?
Well, the mid-year economic and fiscal outlook is exactly that. It's an update. It's not a new budget. The new budget will be out next year. But what we'll continue to do is spend the money in areas where it's needed, like bring forward the infrastructure spending, because that is productivity enhancing investments in the Australian economy, like the extra spending in response to the interim report in the Royal Commission on Aged Care, and like the drought support, which is so important to those communities who have been devastated by this terrible, terrible event.
Are you planning on announcing business tax incentives, or whether it's increasing the instant asset write-off or another incentive to help improve wage growth, because slow wages has been something that Australians have really struggled with over the past decade?
Well, in terms of real wages growth, it's now higher than it was under the Labor Party.
It's still sluggish. It's still sluggish, though.
We'd obviously want it to be higher. When it comes to supporting businesses, as you know, in this year's budget, what we announced was an extension of the instant asset write-off to $30,000 for companies with a turnover of under $50 million, and that's been taken up by hundreds of thousands of companies, and it's helped boost expenditure and support and productivity for that part of the economy. As regards to larger firms, we're continuing to have that discussion with them, because obviously we want to continue to see more business investment, because more business investment means more jobs.
So there is room, you are looking at further stimulus targeted at businesses then in the coming months?
Look, we're having a discussion with the business community about various issues in relation to business investment, but you know, we continue to take the decisions necessary, whether it's on infrastructure, whether it's on drought support, whether it's on aged care or other areas that support those people in need. And I want to point out to you, Shari, that the labour market in Australia has continued to be remarkably resilient. We've got employment growth now at 2%. That's more than double the OECD average, and nearly 3 times what it was under the Labor Party when we came to government. So those numbers in the labour market point to more jobs being created, indeed more than 1.4 million new jobs being created since we came to government.
Treasurer, in terms of tax cuts, the indications are so far that your tax relief from July, people have chosen mainly to save it rather than spend it. Are you looking at therefore bringing forward the second or third stages of tax cuts to really get the economy going and to provide a stimulus?
Well, I see my job and the government's job is to put more money into the pockets of hard-working Australians. It's their choice whether they choose to spend it or save it. That is a choice for them. And you're right, a number of people are paying down their debts and saving their money. And what we did see in these national accounts was an increase in the savings rate. Indeed, more than 70% of people with a mortgage are at least 1 month ahead on their prepayments. So that's quite significant. But in terms of our tax cuts, we've legislated through the Parliament, $158 billion worth of tax cuts. We're abolishing a whole tax bracket, and what we'll see is people who earn between $45,000 and $200,000 pay a marginal rate of no more than 30 cents in the dollar. So, Shari, we're going to have a lot simpler, a lot stronger, a lot fairer tax system as a result of what we have passed through the Parliament, and that has been our immediate priority.
Given that people are choosing at the moment to save their money and pay down their mortgage, as you say, doesn't this make a case for bringing forward the tax cuts that you've already legislated that are coming at this point, that are delayed for the next 3 or 4 years?
Well, our focus is always on ensuring that people earn more and keep more of what they earn, but our priority has been to legislate the tax cuts which we took to the election, $158 billion of tax cuts, and that's what we've done, and that money is flowing into people's pockets.
Is it a discussion you're having about whether to bring forward the second or third stages?
Look, our priority has been to implement the tax cuts that we took to the Australian people. We're always the party of lower taxes. There's no doubt about that. As you know, Labor took $387 billion of higher taxes to the Australian people. We took tax cuts to the Australian people. Despite the opposition from Labor, we got it through the Parliament, and that money is now flowing through to the pockets of hard-working Australians. And in fact, around $25 billion has made its way into the pockets of Australian taxpayers as a result of their 18-19 returns.
Would it jeopardise the surplus for the May budget if you did bring forward the second phase of tax cuts?
Oh, look, you can have as much conjecture as you like, Shari, but I can tell you that we are committed to delivering the surplus, because we're paying as a country $19 billion a year in interest. That's money that could otherwise be spent on other areas of the economy. So our commitment is to ensure that Australia is living within its means and that future generations don't have to pick up the tab for the last. That's why paying down Labor's debt is so important, and that's why delivering the first surplus in 12 years is important, because it's not about a trophy for the cabinet. What it is about the country living within its means, freeing up more money to be spent not on interest payments but on important investments.
And so what I'm asking is, if you did bring forward the tax cuts, would it jeopardise the surplus that you have planned?
Look, our commitment is to delivering a surplus, and that's what we'll do.
Okay. Now, huge news in the last parliamentary sitting week with the government, with you and Scott Morrison announcing a complete overhaul of government departments. There has been a lot of criticism today, and this was obviously shock news just yesterday, particularly to the department heads. There's been a lot of criticism today that the government doesn't care about the arts and that the arts is irrelevant. Is this the case?
That's a spurious argument. In fact, there's been no change to our strong commitment to the arts sector, to arts policy and to arts funding. There's no change to our arts funding, and this is about a machinery of government change, reducing the number of departments to ensure that the bureaucracy is working most efficiently to serve the interests of all Australians, and I think these are important changes announced by the Prime Minister.
The UK election is just a week away. Do you think the Labor Party under Jeremy Corbyn has a significant problem with anti-Semitism, and do you think he deserves to run for public office at all?
Well, as you know, I've made some comments in the past about some of the company that he has kept, which has been bad company indeed. But in terms of anti-Semitism, you've heard it from members of his own party about the allegations of anti-Semitism within the Labor Party. They're very disturbing allegations, very unfortunate, and we've actually seen resignations from the Labor Party as a result.
In terms of anti-Semitism in Europe, there's also been some really horrifying attacks and graffiti in France this week. What's your reaction to that?
Well, of course, the spate of anti-Semitic attacks has not just been confined to Europe and to campuses across the United States and elsewhere. We've actually seen it here in Australia, and that is of deep concern because you know, the use of Nazi insignia and you know, bringing back those terrible memories from that period in history is of deep concern to people who are Jewish and non-Jewish alike, because ultimately Australian servicemen and women fought for freedom against fascism. So any talk about anti-Semitism or any you know, any use of Nazi symbols or Nazi type graffiti is really, really distressing and disturbing.
Treasurer, you had the end of the parliamentary year this week. It was the last parliamentary week of the year. It's been quite a messy end to the year for the government. The week before last, you had a surprise defeat of your union-busting bill. There's the Angus Taylor police investigation has rolled on. How do you think the government is positioned for the new year?
Oh, look, we're very pleased with the developments this year, particularly winning an election, but obviously getting on with producing better outcomes for all Australians. And in terms of the last sitting fortnight, obviously it was a bit disappointing not to get the Ensuring Integrity Bill through, but we're still hopeful of getting that through in the new year, because it is so important to boosting the productivity of the construction industry and more broadly, and stamping out some of the lawlessness that we've seen and holding some of these union officials to account. So that's really important legislation. We obviously got through the legislation on Medivac, and that's, I think, a significant achievement. Then the national accounts show that the Australian economy continued to grow, and all while the Labor Party was still playing its little games and having a dummy spit. By the end of the week, I think the Australian people knew that it was only our side of the house that were getting on with governing and getting on with delivering for Australians, as we promised to do at the election, and we appreciate the trust that they placed in us, and they are our masters and we are their servants, and we look forward to next year being another year of delivering for these people of Australia. You
reintroduced the Union Integrity Bill to the Parliament on Thursday, got it through the lower house. It'll be back in the Senate when Parliament kicks off next year. Mm-hmm. Are you confident that you'll be able to change Jackie Lambie's mind on it?
Oh, look, we'll continue to have discussions, as you would expect, with the crossbench. But what we do know is that the Labor Party are hostage to the interests of the union movement. They receive an enormous amount of money from them, and they have not been able to see through the real benefits to the Australian community of getting this legislation through. There's no reason why people who are engaging in this unlawful behaviour on our building sites, who are driving up the costs of construction, which ultimately is passed through to consumers with the higher costs for building a school or building a hospital or building a commercial building. Ultimately there is no reason why that unlawful behaviour should continue, and that's why this legislation is so important.
Yeah. Lastly, Treasurer, there was quite a funny story in Margin Call in the Australian newspaper today that you wore the same purple tie for 2 weeks straight in Parliament, and this was noticed by one of your young fans who's just finished school. But I want to ask you about the same tie. Was this a repeat of the Karl Stefanovic experiment where, you know, a pro-feminist statement to see if anyone would notice?
No, it wasn't intentional like that. I think it was just the consequence, Shari, of living out of a suitcase and basically having a small number of ties to choose from when I was up in Canberra. But I was delighted to get that very nice letter from a young stranger who obviously was watching politics very closely, and I wore his tie for not just national accounts but also for Parliament and for a number of interviews that I did. And I have to say, that tie from Lowe's was pretty damn good.
Oh, there you go. So it was a case of forgetting to pack more ties when you went to Canberra. Treasurer, thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it.
All the very best to viewers for the Christmas and festive season.
Thank you very much.